Cotton gin man found rolled map in fence post, broke down and wept. What Leroy Aldridge found inside that cedar post would unravel 40 years of quiet theft, and before it was done, a dead man's honor would be the only thing left standing in Lauderdale County. Leroy parked his Ford pickup at the edge of the old gin property on a Tuesday morning in early November, the sky the color of ash, and the air still carrying enough warmth to make a man sweat through his shirt before noon. He'd worked this gin for 31 years, ran the machinery, knew every belt and pulley, knew which press ran hot in August and which conveyor would catch on a Tuesday if you didn't grease it Sunday night. 6 months ago, the plant closed for good, sold to a developer out of Huntsville who had plans for condominiums that might or might not ever get built. Before the new owners came to clear it, Leroy had arranged to take back what he could. Equipment mostly, some cedar fencing that was still good, a few hand tools he'd bought himself back in the 1980s that he didn't see any reason to leave behind for strangers. He worked alone. That was how he preferred it. His wife Norma had passed 3 years back, and since then, Leroy had developed a comfort with solitude that surprised even him. The way a man can get used to quiet, the same way he gets used to a bad knee, until the quiet stops being absence and starts being texture. He brought a thermos of coffee and a pry bar and a flatbed trailer hitched to the Ford, and he set to work on the fence that ran the perimeter of the gin yard. The posts were old cedar, set deep in red Alabama clay. Some had rotted through at the base, leaning at angles that made them look tired and done with the whole business. Others were still solid as the day they were driven in. He worked methodically, starting at the corner nearest the road and moving toward the gate, pulling nails, stacking usable lumber on the trailer, dropping the rotten pieces in a pile to burn later. It was the kind of work that didn't ask anything of you, just your hands and your back, and Leroy had always appreciated work like that. Kept the mind quiet, kept it from going places it didn't need to go. He'd counted the posts out of habit. That was the gin man in him, the counter of bales and bags and belt tensions. Post 17 was near the gate entrance, cedar, maybe 60 years old, still standing upright and looking fine. The nails came loose well enough, but when he worked the pry bar underneath and began rocking it, the post sat stubborn in the clay and wouldn't come. He worked it for a good 5 minutes, back and forth, the wood groaning but not giving. He set his weight into it. The crack, when it came, was sharp and clean. The base of the post came up with a chunk of red clay still attached, and that was when Leroy noticed the hollow. Cedar posts sometimes rotted from the inside out. He'd seen it before. A post that looked sound until you put weight on it, and the whole thing buckled into sawdust. But this hollow wasn't rot. The interior of the post had been carved out deliberate and careful, a cavity about 8 inches long and 4 across, and inside that cavity sat a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a length of ribbon. Leroy set down the pry bar. He crouched in the clay and reached in and pulled the bundle out. The oilcloth was stiff but intact, the seal around it still holding. The ribbon was silk. Faded blue with gold thread running through it, the kind of ribbon you didn't see anymore, the kind that came from a dress shop in a town that no longer had dress shops. He knew that ribbon. He knew it because he'd seen a photograph of it sitting in a frame on his mother's dresser his entire life. The wedding photograph. His parents on the steps of the First Baptist Church of Florence, 1952. And his father had tied that exact ribbon in Beulah's hair before the ceremony. James Aldridge, Private First Class, United States Army. Killed in action in the North African desert in 1943, 9 years before Leroy was ever born. His mother had kept a piece of that ribbon in a cedar box for as long as Leroy could remember. His hands were steady when he unwrapped the oilcloth. He was that kind of man. His hands stayed steady even when everything else in him went sideways. Inside was a rolled paper, protected from moisture by the oilcloth, still legible after what looked like a very long time. He unrolled it carefully on the hood of the Ford and weighted the corners with 2 bolts from his shirt pocket. It took him a few minutes to understand what he was looking at. The paper was a hand-drawn ledger, columns of dates running down the left side, dollar amounts in the middle, account numbers on the right. The dates began in January of 1984 and ran forward for nearly 4 decades, entry by entry, month by month, all the way to the previous spring. At the top of each column, in small and careful handwriting, 2 labels. The first read, Aldridge, WPB. The second read, Diversion, VS Admin, Widow's Pension Benefit. Aldridge, his mother. He stood at the hood of that truck for a long while, reading the columns again. He added figures in his head. Gin work made you fast with numbers. The amounts were modest, ranging from $80 to just over $200 per month, the kind of money that wouldn't attract attention on its own. But multiplied over 40 years of monthly payments, it wasn't modest at all. It was a life's worth of security, drawn out of a woman one small check at a time and sent somewhere else. To someone with the initials VS, someone in the administrator's office. Vernon Steele had been the town administrator in Florence for 36 years. Leroy thought about his mother, the way she kept the thermostat at 62 in January and said she ran warm. The way she'd turned down his offers to take her to dinner in town, saying she'd already eaten something, and then he'd open her refrigerator and find nearly nothing inside. The blood pressure medication she'd quietly stopped taking last spring because, she told him, she felt fine without it, and he'd found out from her doctor, not from her, that she'd been rationing pills for months because she was worried about the cost. He'd been sending her money for years. He thought it was supplementing what she had. He hadn't known she had almost nothing to supplement. He folded the map carefully. He put it back in the oilcloth. He held the blue ribbon in his hand for a moment. It was lighter than he expected, the silk worn thin from handling, and then he put it in his shirt pocket against his chest. He sat down on the broken base of post 17 in the red clay dirt, the oilcloth bundle across his knees. And Leroy Aldridge, who had not cried at his wife's funeral because he'd promised her he wouldn't, who had not cried the day the gin foreman handed him his last paycheck and shook his hand without looking him in the eye. Leroy sat in that dirt and wept. He didn't make much noise about it. He wasn't that kind of man. But he sat there a long time, long enough for the thermos to go cold and for a pair of crows to land in the tree line and move on again without paying him much mind. When he finally stood up, he brushed the clay off his knees and put the bundle under the seat of the Ford. He locked the truck. He walked the rest of the fence line without his pry bar, not pulling posts anymore, just walking slow and looking at each one in turn. Wondering what else had been hidden in this county for 40 years. Wondering who else had known. That night, he lay in the dark of his bedroom and thought about Vernon Steele's face, the handshake at the county fair, the nod across the hardware store, the way the man had always seemed like someone exactly where he was supposed to be. And Leroy thought about his father, who died face down in North African sand before his son was ever born, and whose benefits were supposed to take care of the woman he'd left behind. Supposed to. Tomorrow, Leroy would start making phone calls. He didn't know yet to whom, or in what order, or what he was going to say when somebody picked up. What he knew was that the ribbon was on his nightstand and the map was under the seat of his truck. And Vernon Steele's initials were written in careful handwriting at the top of 40 years of stolen months. That was enough to start. He spread the map on the kitchen table at 9 that evening and did not move from that chair until the sun came up. The kitchen was small and plain, the same linoleum his wife Norma had put down in '93, the same yellow curtains she'd sewn from fabric she bought at the Walmart in Florence, the same cast-iron skillet hanging on the nail beside the stove where it had hung since the first year of their marriage. Leroy made himself a plate of scrambled eggs around 10 and ate without tasting them and pushed the plate aside and kept working. He had a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil and a glass of whiskey he refilled once around midnight and didn't touch after that. The whiskey wasn't for drinking, it was just something to have nearby. The map. He kept calling it the map in his head, though it was more of a ledger, more of a record, had been drawn in 2 hands. The first hand was cramped and careful, the kind of handwriting a man produces when he's copying something he doesn't want to misread. Dates, dollar amounts, account numbers, nothing else. The second hand appeared only in the margins, a looser script written in different ink, as if added later and in haste. The marginal notes were harder to read, abbreviations and partial words. He puzzled them out slowly, one at a time, adding their meanings to the legal pad in his own handwriting. R.O., return office maybe, or routing order. Conf, confirmed. H.A., he wrote a question mark beside this one and moved on. The dates in the first column began in January of 1984. Leroy knew that year. His mother had mentioned it, years back, in a passing way that hadn't seemed significant at the time. 1984 was the year Vernon Steele was appointed town administrator. Leroy remembered seeing it in the weekly paper, a photograph of Steele shaking hands with the mayor on the courthouse steps. It was also the year Beulah had quietly stopped asking Leroy for help with things around the house, and had started instead, developing that particular stubbornness that he'd always read as pride. He understood now it wasn't pride, it was management. She'd been managing what little she had, quietly, for 40 years, and she'd managed it well enough that her own son hadn't seen it clearly for what it was. He worked the numbers on the legal pad. Beulah's widow's benefit had been established in 44, the year after his father was killed. By the time Leroy was old enough to know about such things, late 60s, early 70s, his mother's monthly payment had been modest but reliable. He'd never asked the exact amount. That wasn't the kind of thing you asked a woman like Beulah. But he had a rough sense of what a widow's benefit looked like in those years, and the numbers on the map were lower. Not dramatically lower, just enough to be invisible if you weren't looking. Beginning in January of 84, the amounts dropped further. Not all at once, that would have drawn attention. Gradual. $20 less one month. $30 the next. Restored partially the month after that, then reduced again. The pattern was irregular enough to look like administrative adjustment rather than theft. Every redirected amount ended in the same account number. 6 digits, no bank name listed, just the number. And at the top of the column, VS, admin. Leroy sat with that for a long time. Vernon Steele was 69 years old, soft-spoken, wore a bolo tie to civic events. Coached youth baseball for a stretch in the 1990s. Leroy had a vague memory of seeing his name on a sponsor board outside the ball field. The man had been the public face of Florence's administration for longer than some of the town's residents had been alive. He served on the County Historical Preservation Board. He was a deacon at Second Baptist. Leroy thought about the kind of man who could do a thing like this and then go coach youth baseball. Around 2 in the morning, he went to the hall closet and retrieved his old camera. A 35mm Canon he'd bought used in the late 80s and used primarily for photographs of gin equipment, machinery failures, anything he needed to document for insurance purposes. He still had a partial roll of film in it, unused. He photographed every section of the map under the kitchen light, working slowly, making sure each frame was legible. 16 photographs in all. He rewound the roll and put the camera in the inside pocket of his winter coat, which hung by the door. He would take the film to the drugstore in Rogersville to be developed. Not Florence, not anywhere Vernon Steele's name carried weight. He thought about his mother. She was 85 years old. She weighed perhaps 110 pounds. He'd noticed her thinning over the past several years, the way the tendons in her hands had become visible, the way her dresses hung differently. She still cooked for herself, still kept the house in reasonable order, still went to church on the first and third Sundays of every month with a woman from her congregation named Alma, who picked her up in a Buick the color of old cream. She had a garden in summer, mostly tomatoes and butter beans, and she preserved what she grew with the same methodical care she applied to everything in her life. She was a woman who had survived the death of her husband, the raising of a son alone on almost nothing, the slow diminishment of a body that had worked hard for 8 decades. She had survived all of it without complaint or drama, and in that survival she had developed a dignity so complete and so quiet that most people who encountered her simply felt better without knowing why. She did not know her son was sitting at his kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at the proof of what had been done to her. He would not tell her. Not yet. Not until he understood everything. At first light, he folded the map back into the oilcloth and put it in the cabinet above the refrigerator, behind a stack of Norma's old canning jars. He washed his face and changed his shirt. He drove to Floyd Tanner's diner on the square when it opened at 6, sat at the counter, ordered coffee and biscuits and gravy, and ate slowly while Floyd moved back and forth behind the counter the way he always did. Quick and particular, not much for small talk in the morning, but always present, always paying attention to who was in and what they ordered and how long they sat. Floyd set the coffee pot down and leaned an elbow on the counter. "You look like you've been up all night," he said. "Got to thinking," Leroy said. "Norma always said you did that." Floyd moved the pot back to the burner. "Thinking instead of sleeping." She wasn't wrong. Floyd refilled the cup of the man 2 stools down, a retired school teacher named Gilbert who came in every morning and read the paper without speaking to anyone, and came back and topped off Leroy's cup without being asked. "You settling things up at the gin property?" he said. "Working on it. Heard they're putting condominiums out there." Floyd said the word condominiums the way most men in the county said it, with the patient contempt of someone who knows exactly what's being lost and has already accepted that the knowing won't change a thing. "Be a shame." "Be a lot of things," Leroy said. He paid and left and drove to the county records office when it opened at 8:30. He stood at the counter and asked the woman working the front desk, a young woman he didn't know, about pension distribution records and the town administrator's office correspondence from 1984 onward. The woman said those records would be in archives and that he'd need to fill out a request form. He filled out the form. She told him it might take a week or 2. He drove home. He sat on the back porch in the November light, which was pale and thin, and fell across the yard without warming anything. There was a persimmon tree at the corner of the fence line, Norma's tree. She planted it from a seedling the second year they lived in the house, and the fruit was still on the branches, orange against the gray sky, the leaves mostly down. A mockingbird was working through the tree methodically, hitting each persimmon once and moving to the next. Leroy watched the bird and thought about the account number at the top of the ledger column. 6 digits, no name. That number went somewhere. It had been going somewhere for 40 years. A number like that left a trail if you knew how to follow it, and Leroy didn't know how to follow it, but he suspected that someone in a courthouse or a bank or a government office would know. The question was who to ask without tipping Vernon Steele that someone was asking. That evening, the phone rang. Leroy picked up on the second ring. The voice on the other end was a woman, the records clerk from the county office, the young one he didn't know. She sounded uncertain, as if she were reading from something written in front of her. "Mr. Aldridge? I'm calling about the records request you filed this morning." "I remember," Leroy said. A pause. "I've been asked to let you know that those records, the ones you requested from the administrator's office, are under a routine administrative review. They may not be accessible for some time." Another pause, shorter. "I'm sorry. I'm sure it's just procedure." Leroy thanked her and set the phone in the cradle and stood in the kitchen for a moment without moving. He had filed that request 8 hours ago. The only people who would know about it were the clerk who took it, and whoever she'd told, and whoever that person had called. Vernon Steele already knew Leroy had been to the records office. The next morning, Leroy drove to Rogersville and dropped the camera film at the drugstore and paid for 2 sets of prints and told them he'd be back Thursday. He drove home the long way, along the river road, where the Tennessee ran wide and gray under the November sky, and the bare sycamores leaned out over the banks like men checking the depth. He didn't stop. He just drove and thought. By the time he got home, there was a truck parked in front of his house. Not a truck he recognized. A late-model Chevrolet, dark green, clean, the kind of clean that said it spent its life on paved roads. Floyd Tanner was standing beside it with his hands in his jacket pockets, not leaning on anything, just standing the way a man stands when he's decided to wait however long it takes. Leroy pulled the Ford alongside the curb and got out. "Floyd." "Leroy." Floyd looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. "Got a few minutes?" "I got time." They went inside. Leroy put coffee on and brought 2 cups to the kitchen table, and they sat. Floyd was 63, a big man going soft through the middle, with a face that had spent 40 years over a short-order grill and showed it, red and lined and permanently damp around the hairline. He'd run the diner since his father died in the mid-'80s, and he knew the county the way only a man who feeds it every morning can know it. Names and habits, and who sat with whom, and who stopped coming in after what particular event. Floyd wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the table. "Vernon Steele came in for lunch yesterday," he said. "He does most days," Leroy said. "He does," Floyd nodded. "Yesterday he sat at the end booth and had his usual, and then he asked me, casual, you know how he does, like it's just conversation. He asked me if I'd seen much of you lately. Said he'd heard you were going through a hard time, the gin closing and all." Leroy said nothing. "I said I'd seen you that morning for breakfast, that you seemed fine." Floyd looked up from the cup. Then he said he was a little worried, said he'd heard you'd been into the records office asking about pension matters, and that you seemed, confused was the word he used, confused about some financial matters related to your mother. Said it might be the grief from Norma, delayed. Floyd set the cup down. "He said if I saw you, I might encourage you to talk to somebody, a doctor or your pastor." The coffee maker clicked and went quiet. Outside, a car passed on the road. "He said that," Leroy said. "He said that." Floyd pulled at the handle of his cup. "I didn't say I would or I wouldn't. I came here instead." He looked at Leroy straight. "You confused about something, Leroy?" "No," Leroy said. "I'm not confused about anything." Floyd studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies something he's trying to read in bad light. Then he nodded once, slow. "All right," he said. He stood and pushed the chair back and put on his jacket. At the door, he stopped. "Vernon Steele's been in that office since before half this county was born. You understand what that means." "I understand it," Leroy said. "Good." Floyd opened the door. "You need something? You call me." He drove away in the green Chevrolet, and Leroy stood in the doorway and watched him go, and then went back to the kitchen and sat for a long time without touching his coffee. He thought about what it meant that Steele already knew about the records request and had moved before 24 hours were out. The man had spent 36 years building a structure of favors and obligations and small dependencies, the kind of structure that didn't announce itself, that looked from the outside like community and civic pride and a man who remembered your name at the hardware store. You only saw the structure when you pushed against it. Leroy had pushed against it once, gently, and it had already begun to push back. He drove to the county courthouse the following morning and went directly to the records room rather than the front desk. The records room was staffed by a woman named Ruth Giles, who'd worked in that building since before Leroy's wife was alive. She was 61, gray-haired, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and knew where every document in that building had been filed since 1988. She and Leroy had spoken maybe a dozen times over the years. County business, property questions after Norma died, nothing significant. She looked up when he came in, and something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite welcome. "Leroy," she said. "Ruth, I put in a records request yesterday morning. The young woman at the front said it might take a week or two. I was wondering if I could just take a look at what's in the administrator's correspondence files from '84. Shouldn't take long." Ruth took off her glasses and let them hang on the chain and looked at the surface of her desk. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed, a silence with weight in it, like a room after a door closes. "Those files are being reviewed," she said. "I can't release them while the review is ongoing." "What kind of review?" She looked at him then. "Administrative, routine." The words came out flat and careful, the way words come when someone has chosen them in advance. "Leroy, I want you to know, I got a call this morning from the administrator's office." She stopped. "I was told you'd been in, that you might come back. I was told to." She stopped again and straightened a stack of papers on her desk that didn't need straightening. "I was told to let you know the files you wanted weren't available." Who told you that? She put her glasses back on. I think you know. Leroy leaned on the counter. He kept his voice even. Ruth, I'm not confused. I'm not grieving myself into a mistake. I found something, and what I found is real. And the reason Vernon Steele is moving this fast is because he knows it too. Ruth looked at the papers on her desk. Her hands were still. I've got 22 months until I retire, she said quietly. I've got a pension I've been paying into for 31 years. She said it without apology, without drama, just fact. The way a woman presents the dimensions of a room she didn't build and cannot enlarge. I understand, Leroy said, and he did. He thanked her and left. He was in the truck when the real weight of it settled on him. Not anger, or not only anger. A kind of cold clarity, the same clarity he used to feel at the gym when a machine began throwing numbers that didn't match the previous shift's numbers, and you knew something was wrong, but you couldn't yet see where. You had to trace it back, belt by belt, pulley by pulley, until you found the thing that was off. He drove home the long way again, past the river. The Tennessee was high from last week's rain, muddy at the edges, running fast in the middle. There was a great blue heron standing in the shallows near the far bank, motionless as carved wood, watching the water. Leroy pulled over and looked at it for a while. The heron didn't move. The river moved around it. That evening, just past 9, a car came down Leroy's road and stopped in front of his house and sat with the engine running for a full minute before the door opened. Leroy watched from the front window, the light off in the room so he wouldn't be visible. It was a county sheriff's cruiser. The man who got out was Dwayne Loomis, who had been Lauderdale County Sheriff for 14 years. He was 58, barrel-chested, with white hair cut military short and the particular walk of a man who has never doubted that his arrival changes the nature of a room. He came to the door and knocked twice. Leroy put the light on and answered it. "Dwayne," he said. "Leroy." The sheriff looked at him with an expression that was almost kind, the kind that precedes something difficult. "Mind if I come in?" They sat in the living room. Loomis declined coffee. He set his hat on his knee and laced his fingers over it and began in the measured tone of someone who has rehearsed the thing they are about to say. There had been some concern, he explained, from folks who cared about Leroy. The gin closing was a hard thing. 31 years of a man's working life, that was no small loss. And Norma passing the way she had, a man could find himself in a dark stretch without quite realizing it. Start looking for explanations where there weren't any. Start seeing patterns in things. It was natural, nothing to be ashamed of. Leroy listened. "I've been told," Loomis continued, "that you've been making inquiries about pension matters and government accounts. Records going back 30, 40 years. He looked at Leroy steadily. "These things are complicated. Government pension administration, federal redirections, amended disbursements. There's paperwork and procedure behind all of it that can look one way to a layman and mean something entirely different to someone with the training to read it. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand what you're saying," Leroy said. Loomis nodded. He leaned forward slightly. "I'd hate to see you cause yourself trouble, Leroy. Or your mother. She's a fine woman, 85 years old. She doesn't need complications in her life." He let that sit for a moment. "You think about that." He stood and put his hat on and thanked Leroy for his time and walked back down the porch steps to the cruiser and drove away. Leroy stood at the door until the taillights disappeared around the bend. He counted backward in his head. 40 hours since he'd filed a simple records request. In those 40 hours, Vernon Steele had spoken to Floyd Tanner, had locked down the records room through Ruth Giles, and had sent the county sheriff to Leroy's home in the dark to mention, gently, that his elderly mother might suffer from complications. A man doesn't build that kind of machinery unless he has something worth protecting. Leroy went to the kitchen cabinet above the refrigerator and took down the oilcloth bundle and set it on the table. He opened it and looked at the map for a long time without touching it. Then he looked at the blue ribbon, which he'd left folded alongside it. He had a decision to make. He could make it quietly, inside county lines, with whatever goodwill remained. Or he could go somewhere Vernon Steele's reach didn't extend. He picked up the telephone and dialed information and asked for the number of the Alabama State Bar Association's referral service. He wrote the number on the legal pad. He'd call in the morning. He didn't sleep that night. Not much. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about the machinery that had just shown itself, and about the man who'd built it, and about the ribbon on the kitchen table that had once been wound through his mother's hair on the best day of her life. By morning, he knew exactly where he was going. The question now was how much it would cost him to get there, and whether what was waiting at the other end was worth the price. He drove to Tuscaloosa on a Wednesday, leaving before first light. The drive was 2 hours on 2-lane roads through the flat river country, then up through the pine hills where the land started to roll and the morning fog sat in the low places like something left behind. He'd made an appointment through the bar referral service with a lawyer named Nadine Mercer, whose office was above a pharmacy on a side street 3 blocks off the main square. He found the building without trouble, parked the Ford at a meter, and climbed a narrow staircase that smelled of lemon oil and old wood. A hand-lettered sign on the frosted glass door read, "Nadine Mercer, attorney at law, by appointment." She opened the door herself. 54, maybe 55, small and precise, with gray-streaked hair pulled back tight, and the kind of eyes that take inventory of a room in the first 2 seconds of entering it. She shook his hand, firm, brief, and showed him to a chair across from her desk, which was stacked with files arranged in a system that only she probably understood and yet looked, somehow, completely deliberate. Leroy laid it out without preamble. The gin property, the fence post, the oilcloth bundle, the map and what was on it, the dates, the amounts, the account number at the top of the column, Vernon Steele's initials. The 40 years of monthly diversions from Beulah's widow's pension, draining down in increments small enough to look like administrative adjustment to anyone who wasn't comparing them against the original benefit amount. He told her about the records request and the clerk and Floyd and the sheriff's visit. He put the map on her desk. He'd brought the original, wrapped in the oilcloth, which he now recognized was a decision he hadn't consciously made, but that turned out to be the right one. She looked at it without touching it for a moment, then put on a pair of reading glasses and studied it in sections, moving her finger along the columns without quite making contact with the paper. When he finished, she sat back and removed her glasses and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then at him. "How much have you told anyone?" she said. "Floyd Tanner knows I'm looking into something. He doesn't know what. Ruth Giles at the records room, same. The sheriff knows I filed a records request. Nobody has seen this map except me and now you." "Your mother?" "No." Nadine nodded slowly. She picked up a pen and turned it in her fingers, not writing anything. "All right," she said, "here's what I can tell you. What you have here, if it's authentic, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, is evidence of a sustained federal crime. Pension benefits administered by the VA are federal funds. Diverting them is mail fraud at minimum, pension theft, conspiracy if others were involved. The FBI handles this. The VA's Office of Inspector General handles this." She paused. "It is not a small thing." "I didn't think it was," Leroy said. "No," she set the pen down. "But here's what else I can tell you. The process of bringing this to light will be long. We are talking about years, not months. Filing with the VA, federal investigation, grand jury proceedings if the evidence supports charges, trial preparation, trial." She looked at him steadily. "Every step of that process is, at some point, public record. Reporters from the county paper will cover the arrest if there is one. The Birmingham paper might pick it up. Federal pension fraud, small-town administrator, 40 years. That's a story people read." She folded her hands on the desk. "Your mother will not learn about this from you, in a way and at a time of your choosing. She will learn about it from a newspaper, or from her neighbor, or from the woman who drives her to church. She will be asked questions she doesn't have answers to. She will be required, possibly, to give a deposition. She is 85 years old with a heart condition. Leroy said nothing. And the town, Nadine continued, not unkindly. A man like Vernon Steele, 36 years in office, deacon, Little League, the whole apparatus. When something like this comes out, a community divides. Some people will see what the evidence shows. Others will see a man they've known their whole lives and a newcomer stirring up the past for reasons they can't fathom. Your mother lives in that town. You live in that town. The next several years of your life in that community will be defined by this. She let the silence hold for a moment. I'm not telling you not to proceed, she said. I'm telling you what proceeding looks like. You came here for honest counsel. That's it. Leroy looked at the map on her desk. He looked at the ribbon, which he'd unthinkingly placed alongside it when he unwrapped the oilcloth. The blue silk against the dark wood of the desk. What would you do? He said. Nadine looked at him without expression for a moment. Then she said, I'd take my mother to dinner and not say a word and sleep on it for a month. She paused. But I'm not you, and she's not my mother, and I didn't find what you found. He took the map and the ribbon and drove home. For 2 weeks, he said nothing to anyone. He went about his days in the deliberate way of a man who has decided to let the water settle before he reaches into it. He drove out to the gin property twice and did small work, moving lumber, checking that nothing had been disturbed. He picked up the developed photographs from the drugstore in Rogersville, put them in an envelope, put the envelope in the cabinet above the refrigerator beside the oilcloth bundle, and did not look at either again. He visited Beulah on a Thursday. She'd made a pot of chicken and dumplings, and the small house smelled of bay leaf and black pepper, and the particular warmth that a gas stove gives off when it's been running all afternoon. He ate 2 bowls, and she watched him eat with the satisfaction of a woman for whom feeding her son is one of the remaining pleasures she allows herself without apology. The kitchen was tidy, the counters clear, a calendar from the Florence hardware store thumbtacked to the wall with the church Sundays circled in red pen. You seem far away, she said, when he'd pushed the second bowl aside. Just thinking, he said. You've been thinking a lot lately. She got up and refilled his water glass without asking and sat back down. Her hands on the table were pale and thin, the knuckles large from decades of work. His father's wedding ring, the one she'd worn on her right hand since his father died, was loose on her finger, turning slightly sideways. You sleeping all right? Well enough, he said. She looked at him the way mothers look at grown sons when they know perfectly well the answer is a lie and have decided not to press it. You know you can tell me things, she said. I'm old, but I'm not fragile. I know, Mama, he said. He drove home in the dark and sat in the truck in his driveway for a long time before going inside. The decision, when he finally made it, came in the way that the worst decisions come, not with the feeling of resolution, but with the feeling of relief, which is a different thing and a more dangerous one. He sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in late November and told himself it was enough to know the truth. He did not have to destroy what remained of his mother's peace to prove something to a courthouse 2 counties over. The money was gone. The years were gone. Vernon Steele was 69 years old, and his time would come regardless. Some truths were too expensive to speak out loud. He went to the fireplace and built a small fire, and took the envelope of photographs from the cabinet. He held it in both hands over the flames, and let it go. The envelope caught at the corner, then the center, the photographs curling and darkening and becoming nothing. He watched until there was only ash. Then he took the oilcloth bundle from the cabinet and unwrapped it on the kitchen table and looked at the map. He held it over the fire by one corner. His hands stopped. He stood there for a full minute. The fire pulled heat up past his fingers. The corner of the oilcloth began to soften from the warmth, not catching, just softening. His hands didn't move. He could not do it. He pulled the map back from the fire and wrapped it in the oilcloth and stood at the kitchen table breathing. He didn't know precisely why his hands had stopped. He wasn't sure it was a decision so much as a fact, The same kind of fact as the floor being solid under his feet or the fire being hot. Some things simply were. He could not destroy this map. Whether that was justice or stubbornness or something he didn't have a word for, he couldn't say. He put the bundle back in the cabinet and poured out the rest of the whiskey in his glass and washed the glass and set it on the dish rack. He went to bed. He lay in the dark. 3 days later, the phone rang at 6:15 in the morning, and the voice on the other end was the duty nurse at Eliza Coffey Memorial Hospital in Florence, telling him that his mother had fallen. He drove to Florence in the dark, with his jaw set and his hands steady on the wheel, and his mind doing the thing it did in emergencies, which was to go very quiet and very small and focus on the next necessary thing only. The duty nurse had said hip and wrist, had said the surgery went well, had said stable, and those 3 words had been enough to get him dressed and out the door and into the Ford without his coffee or his coat. He got the coat from the back seat at a red light in town. He drove the hospital route he'd driven twice in the past 4 years, once for Norma, once for a scare with his own heart that turned out to be nothing. And he parked in the same lot and went through the same sliding doors and stood at the same admissions desk and gave his mother's name. They took him up to the 3rd floor. The room was small and pale, the curtains drawn against the early dark, a monitor running its quiet line beside the bed. Beulah was asleep. She looked smaller than he remembered her looking 3 days ago at the kitchen table. The wrist was splinted and elevated. Her face was relaxed in sleep in a way it almost never was when she was awake. The constant slight tension she carried, the readiness, was gone from it, and what remained was just the face of a woman who had been working hard for 85 years and had finally been forced to stop. Leroy sat in the chair beside the bed. He did not turn on the room light. He sat in the dim and looked at his mother's hands and listened to the monitor and the muffled sounds of the corridor outside. And he stayed that way until the window began to gray with first light and a different nurse came in to check vitals and smiled at him without comment, the way hospital staff smile at people who have clearly been there all night. The surgeon came at 7:30. Young man, competent, brisk without being unkind. He explained the procedure. The hip had required a partial replacement, standard for her age and the nature of the fracture. The wrist was a clean break that would knit in 6 to 8 weeks with proper immobilization. The surgery had gone without complication. The recovery, however, would require a period of inpatient rehabilitation, likely 4 to 6 weeks, followed by ongoing assistance at home. She would need help with daily tasks, cooking, bathing, moving around the house. The surgeon was careful and precise about this. The level of independence Beulah had maintained was not going to be possible in the same way going forward. Her body had made a decision, and the most useful thing anyone could do now was adapt to it. Leroy thanked the man and shook his hand, and the surgeon left and the room went quiet again. He sat beside his mother's bed and looked at her hands. The wedding ring on the right hand had been removed during surgery and placed in a small plastic bag on the bedside table. He picked it up. His father had bought that ring in a jewelry shop in Florence in the spring of 1952, before he shipped out the final time, the time he didn't come back from. It was a plain gold band, thin and worn smooth from 60-some years on Beulah's finger. It weighed almost nothing. He thought about what Nadine Mercer had said, that Beulah would not learn the truth from him, in a way, and at a time of his choosing. She would learn it from a neighbor or a newspaper. He had spent weeks turning that over, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the angle where it didn't matter. There wasn't one. He'd been protecting his mother from knowledge she had a right to, and he'd been telling himself it was for her sake. And sitting in that pale hospital room in the early morning light, he understood that he'd been at least partly wrong. He'd been protecting himself too, from the cost of telling her, from the look on her face when he did, from the long and public unraveling that would follow. He'd dressed that up as concern for her health and her peace, and it wasn't entirely false, but it wasn't entirely honest either. The independence Beulah had maintained was not going to be possible in the same way going forward. The surgeon had said it about her body, but it was true about other things as well. She was going to spend the next months in a rehabilitation facility, and then in her own home with daily assistance. Her life was going to become smaller and more bounded, regardless of what Leroy did or didn't do. The future he'd been protecting her from, the complicated, public, difficult future, was going to arrive whether he opened the door or not. The only question was whether she'd walk into it, knowing what had been done to her, and knowing her son had fought for her, or whether she'd walk into it ignorant and undefended, while the man who'd stolen 40 years of her husband's legacy continued to go to Second Baptist on alternate Sundays and eat lunch at Floyd Tanner's diner. Beulah opened her eyes at 8:15. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the window, then at Leroy. She seemed unsurprised to find him there, the way mothers are unsurprised by the things their children do that are in keeping with who those children are. "I fell off my own shelf," she said. Her voice was dry from the anesthesia, but steady. "I know," Leroy said, reaching for soup. She considered this for a moment. Clam chowder, store brand. She looked at her splinted wrist. Didn't even want clam chowder particularly. "How do you feel?" Like a woman who hit a floor she should have seen coming. She looked at him then, a real look, the kind that didn't have time for ceremony. "How bad?" He told her what the surgeon had told him, plainly and in order, the way she would want it told. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I'll need help," she said. "Yes." "At the house?" "Yes." She absorbed this. Outside in the corridor, a cart rattled past. "I suppose I knew this was coming," she said, not to him particularly. "I just didn't think it would be soup that did it." She looked at the plastic bag with the ring in it on the bedside table, and Leroy handed it to her, and she held it in her good hand and looked at it for a while. "Your father gave me this the week before he shipped out the last time," she said. "Put it on my finger and said he'd be back before I knew it." She paused. "He was wrong about that part." "He was," Leroy said. She turned the ring in her fingers. "He was right about most things," she said. "Just not that one." Leroy sat with her until she slept again. Then he went to the corridor and found a payphone near the elevator bank and dialed Nadine Mercer's number from the card he'd kept in his wallet since October. She picked up on the third ring. "It's Leroy Aldridge," he said. "I need you to proceed." A brief pause. "All right," Nadine said. "I'll need you to come in this week and make an official statement. Are you prepared to do that?" "Yes," he said. "And the map?" "I have it." "Good. Don't let it out of your possession." Another pause. "Mr. Aldridge, once we file with the VA, this moves on its own schedule. You understand that? We won't be able to slow it or redirect it." "I understand." "All right." He heard a drawer open on her end, papers moving. "Come Thursday, 9 o'clock." He drove to Nadine's office on Thursday and sat across her desk and told the whole of it again into a tape recorder, slowly and in order, beginning with the fence post and ending with a telephone call at 6:15 in the morning. She asked questions at intervals, precise, short questions, and he answered each one. She made notes in a legal pad and asked him to sign a statement, which he did. She told him she would file the official complaint with the VA's Office of Inspector General the following week and simultaneously with the State Attorney General's office. She said they would hear from the VA within 30 to 60 days. She said to go home and tell no one and change nothing about his routine. He drove home and did not change anything about his routine. He visited his mother at the rehabilitation facility on Tuesday and Friday of each week. He brought her butter beans from a jar she'd put up in September, and she ate them in the facility's dining room, and talked about the woman in the next room who kept a small radio going all night, which she found both aggravating and oddly companionable. 3 weeks after Nadine filed the complaint, 2 men in dark coats and government credentials arrived at Leroy's door on a Thursday morning and spent 4 hours at his kitchen table going through the map entry by entry. They took photographs of it and asked him to sign a chain of custody document. They were thorough and quiet and gave nothing away. When they left, Leroy stood at the front window and watched the government sedan back out of his driveway and head toward town. 4 days later, on a cold Saturday in January, Vernon Steele was arrested at his home on Poplar Street at 7:15 in the morning. The deputy who came to the door was from the Federal Marshal's Service, not the local department. Dwayne Loomis had not been notified in advance. By noon, the story was on the radio. By afternoon, the county had divided as cleanly and completely as a piece of wood along a good grain. And Leroy's name was on the news and in the mouths of people he hadn't thought about in years. And he knew, without having to be told, that Florence would not be the same place it was 3 months ago, and would not be for a long time to come. He drove to the rehabilitation facility that afternoon. Beulah was in the common room, working a jigsaw puzzle with her good hand, the other one propped on a pillow on the table beside her. She looked up when Leroy came in and read his face the way she had always read his face, and she set down the puzzle piece she was holding. He pulled a chair close and told her everything. The federal courthouse in Birmingham was a building that had been designed to communicate permanence. Granite steps, brass fixtures, the kind of ceilings that made voices travel upward and dissipate before they reached anyone. Leroy drove down on the first morning of the trial in his Ford, alone, leaving Florence before 5 to beat the traffic on the interstate. He parked in a municipal lot 2 blocks from the courthouse and sat in the truck for a few minutes, drinking coffee from a thermos and watching the city wake up around him. He had not been to Birmingham in 11 years. Norma had liked it, the museums, the botanical garden she'd visited once with her sister. Leroy had always found it large in a way that made him feel like something left in the wrong drawer. He went inside and found the courtroom on the 3rd floor and took a seat in the back row of the gallery. He was 40 minutes early. He used the time to study the room, the bench, the jury box, the defense and prosecution tables. Vernon Steele arrived 20 minutes before the proceedings began, walking between his attorney and a younger man who might have been a paralegal or a son. It was hard to tell. He wore a dark suit and his hair was combed with the care of a man who understood that appearance was, at this moment, a form of argument. He looked smaller than Leroy remembered. Not physically. The man was still broad through the shoulders, still had the particular posture of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and being recognized. But something in him had contracted. The certainty that had always surrounded him like a weather system had thinned. His wife sat 3 rows in front of Leroy, on the defense side of the gallery. She was a pale woman in her mid-60s, wearing a gray dress, and she did not look at her husband when he entered. She looked at her hands in her lap. The trial lasted 8 days. Leroy attended every one of them. The federal prosecutor was a woman named Clara Watts, mid-40s, from the Birmingham field office, with the quality of stillness that the best trial lawyers develop, the ability to stand in front of a jury and let the silence do work on their behalf. She did not perform. She simply laid things down, one beside the next, the way you'd lay out the parts of a disassembled machine when you needed everyone in the room to understand how the machine worked. She began with the original benefit authorization. Private First Class James Aldridge, killed in action on the 14th of October 1943 in Tunisia. Widow's benefit established in favor of Beulah May Aldridge in February of 44. The benefit had been administered without interruption from that date forward, until Vernon Steele took office as Florencetown administrator in January of 1984, at which point the payment amounts had begun to drift downward in a pattern that was not random. She put the figures on a board the jury could see. Monthly amounts, 40 years of them, laid out in 2 columns. What Beulah had received and what she had been entitled to receive. The gap was modest in any single month. Across 4 decades, it accumulated into a number that sat in the room with a weight that was almost physical. $217,000, plus accrued interest calculated by the VA's Forensic Accounting Division. The defense attorney, a man named Hargrove who had driven down from Nashville and charged accordingly, made the bureaucratic error argument with a straight face and considerable skill. Federal Pension Administration was complex. Directives changed. Rounding protocols shifted. A small-town administrator working without specialized financial training could easily have implemented adjustments in good faith that resulted in unintentional discrepancies. He said the word unintentional the way a man says a word he has decided will save his client, slowly and with emphasis. Clara Watts let him finish. Then she called her first witness. The retired postal worker was a man named Gus Pickett, 71, who had spent 30 years on the Florence rural route and remembered things about mail the way some men remember box scores. He had noticed over the course of several years in the late 1980s and through the 90s that certain pieces of government mail addressed to a handful of the older families on his route were occasionally removed from locked boxes before he arrived. The boxes opened with what appeared to be a master key or a duplicate, and then replaced. He had reported this once to his supervisor, been told it was likely a family member checking on an elderly relative's correspondence, and had not pushed it further. He said this in a voice that carried the particular quality of a man who has spent 30 years wondering if he should have pushed harder. The second witness was a retired bank teller named Patsy Vickers, who had worked at the Florence Savings Bank from 1979 to 2003. She described a period in the early 90s when she had been asked by her branch manager to process a series of redirected government disbursements into a local account under what was described to her as an authorized power of attorney arrangement. The account was numbered, not named. She had processed the transactions as instructed. She said she had not asked questions because she had been 26 years old, and the instruction had come from her manager, and in 1991, that was how things worked. She said this without self-pity and without excuse, just information. The way people give information when they have had a long time to decide exactly how much of it they are responsible for. Clara Watts put Leroy on the stand on the 5th day. He had spoken with Nadine Mercer to prepare, going through the sequence of events twice in her office the week before, answering her practice questions until the account came out clean and in order. He was not nervous. He was not calm either, precisely. He was the way he'd been on the night he'd read the map the first time, reduced to a kind of focused function that didn't leave room for other states. He sat in the witness chair and looked at the jury, 12 people, 8 of them older than 50, most from outside the county, and answered the questions Nadine had arranged with the prosecutor. The fence post, the oilcloth, the map and what was on it. He described his mother's kitchen, the thermostat at 62 in January, the refrigerator with almost nothing in it, the blood pressure medication she'd been rationing because she'd told herself she felt fine without it, and the real reason was she was worried about the cost. He said these things quietly and in order and did not embellish them. The jury listened. 2 of the women in the front row did not look away from him while he spoke. Hargrove cross-examined him for an hour and a half. He was skilled, and he worked the angles, the deteriorated state of the map, the time elapsed since the earliest entries, the impossibility of Leroy knowing with certainty that the account number corresponded to a steel-controlled account without forensic verification. Leroy answered each question directly. He did not speculate beyond what he knew. When Hargrove asked him why he believed the map was authentic, Leroy said, "Because my father's wedding ribbon was wrapped around it, and my father has been dead since 1943, and that ribbon had to get into that fence post some way." Hargrove had no follow-up question. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 12 minutes, guilty on all 18 counts. Vernon Steele sat motionless while the verdict was read, his hands flat on the table in front of him, his eyes directed at some point between himself and the jury box that wasn't anything. His attorney put a hand briefly on his shoulder and removed it. His wife, in the gallery, made no sound. She had been making no sound for 8 days, sitting in the same gray dress or one identical to it, and she made no sound now, and Leroy, watching her from the back row, thought that she had known for a long time and that this moment for her was not revelation but only confirmation, which in its way was worse. Leroy stood and put on his jacket and was moving toward the aisle when a hand came down on his arm. He turned. An elderly man, thin, white-haired, a veteran's pin on the lapel of his sport coat. The kind of pin that said Korea on it in small letters. He was perhaps 78, perhaps 80. His eyes were damp, and he was smiling with the careful dignity of a man who has decided he is allowed to feel something. "Walt Pearson," he said. He extended his hand and Leroy shook it. "My pension was on that list too. Not your mother's list, a different one. Different administrator, same scheme, different county. Your case broke the whole thing open." He tightened the handshake for a moment. "I've been waiting 5 years for somebody to find something. I'm getting back payments, starting next month." He let go of Leroy's hand and looked at him steadily. "I want you to know what you did." Leroy said he was glad. He meant it. They stood in the emptying corridor for a moment, and then Walt Pearson nodded and turned and walked slowly toward the elevator, and Leroy watched him go. Nadine found him at the elevator bank 5 minutes later. She had her briefcase and her coat and the expression of a woman who had just done 8 days of work and was already thinking about the next thing. She stopped beside him, and they stood looking at the corridor for a moment. "There's something else," she said. She said it in the tone she used when information required preface, not hesitation, just the acknowledgement that what followed needed a moment of preparation. She told him what the VA investigators had found, Vernon Steele's background, the full history pulled during the federal investigation. His father, Harold Steele, had been killed in the Pacific Theater in 1945. Vernon had been born in 48, 3 years after. He had been raised by his mother alone on a small farm outside Rogersville, 12 miles from where Beulah Aldridge had raised Leroy. The two families had been within a morning's drive of each other for 6 decades. In the investigation's background research, pulling photographs from county records and probate files, they had found an image of Vernon Steele as a boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, standing in front of a clapboard house with his mother. He was wearing, tied around his wrist, a piece of blue silk ribbon with gold thread through it. Leroy looked at her. "The ribbon in the fence post," Nadine said. "The investigators believe it originated from a French silk shipment that American soldiers brought back or sent home as gifts in 42, 43. Several men from this region were known to have sent such things. Your father may have sent 2. Or Vernon Steele's father sent one, and it came into Vernon's possession." She paused. "Or there's a third possibility, which the investigators believe is more likely. Vernon Steele knew your father before the war. They grew up 12 miles apart. It's possible they were acquainted. It's possible Vernon's father and your father served near each other." Leroy said nothing. "The investigators think Vernon may have had some feeling toward your mother," Nadine said carefully. "Not an action, not a contact, but a feeling. That he watched from a distance when James died and Beulah was left alone. And that when he came into power 40 years later, what he did wasn't simply greed." She looked at him. It was about control, the only kind he could get, over a situation that had defined his whole life without ever giving him what he wanted from it. Leroy stood with that for a moment in the granite corridor of the federal courthouse while the last of the gallery filed past him. "He kept the ribbon," Leroy said. "He did," Nadine said. Leroy thought about a boy growing up 12 miles from a woman who had never belonged to him, holding a piece of silk from the same place the man she'd loved had been. He thought about how a thing like that could curdle inside a person over 40 years, slowly, until it didn't feel like bitterness anymore, just felt like the shape of things. He didn't forgive it. He had no intention of forgiving it. But he understood it in the way you understand the mechanism of a thing after you've taken it apart, clearly and without warmth. "Thank you," he said to Nadine. He rode the elevator down and walked the 2 blocks to the municipal lot and got in the Ford and drove out of Birmingham as the afternoon light went flat and the city gave way to the pine hills and then the river country and then the long straight roads home. He drove without the radio. The road came at him steady in the headlights, mile after mile. He thought about his father's face, which he had never seen except in photographs, and about a piece of silk that had traveled from France to North Africa to Alabama, wrapped around a dead man's legacy for 40 years, waiting in a cedar post for someone to come along and pull it free. He got home at 9. He parked in the driveway and cut the engine and sat in the dark of the truck for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp over the bare trees. After a while, he went inside and hung up his coat and filled a glass of water and drank it at the sink. Then he went to the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped it on the kitchen table one more time. The map, the ribbon. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he folded the ribbon carefully and set it aside and rolled the map back into the oilcloth and tied it shut. He would take it to Nadine's office in the morning. The chain of custody required it. The federal case would need it in the record. It would go into an archive somewhere and become evidence and then history. But tonight it was still on his kitchen table, and the ribbon was beside it, and the house was quiet around him, with the specific quiet of a house where justice has finally, at great cost, found the right address. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks after the verdict, in the same Birmingham courtroom on a Thursday morning in late March, when the dogwoods along the highway were just beginning to open, and the air had that particular quality of early Alabama spring, warm enough to fool you, cold enough to remind you it could still change. Leroy drove down alone again. He sat in the same back row. The courtroom was fuller this time. Reporters from the county paper and 2 from Birmingham, a photographer who was told by the bailiff to put the camera away, several people Leroy recognized from Florence, whose presence he noted without surprise. The world had an appetite for the formal closing of things, even when the closing changed nothing about the years that had already passed. The federal judge was a woman in her 60s, unhurried, with the quality of attention that comes from 30 years of listening to people in difficult circumstances try to explain themselves. She had reviewed the pre-sentencing report and the victim impact statements. Nadine had helped Leroy and Beulah each prepare one, though Beulah had ultimately written hers herself, in her own hand, on 2 pages of lined notebook paper, and Leroy had read it only once before putting it in the envelope, and had not been able to read it again since. Hargrove made a final argument for leniency on Vernon Steele's behalf. He cited his client's age, his 36 years of public service, his lack of prior criminal record, his declining health. He was thorough and professional, and the argument landed in the courtroom the way arguments land when the evidence has already done its work, correctly assembled, no longer capable of changing anything. Vernon Steele was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He stood. He was 69 years old, and he looked, in the March light of the courthouse, like a man who had aged a decade in 4 months. He held a piece of paper but did not look at it. He said that he regretted the harm done to Beulah Aldrich and to the other families affected by his actions. He said he had told himself for many years that what he was doing was a kind of management, a kind of order, that the money went to purposes that served the community. He said he understood now that this was not true and had never been true. He said he was sorry. He said it with the posture of a man who means it and the voice of a man who knows that meaning it has arrived approximately 40 years too late. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal custody. She noted that the scope and duration of the crime, its targeting of a military widow, and the systematic nature of the concealment all argued against leniency. She said federal pension funds existed because the country had made a promise to the families of those who served, and that promise was not a technicality. The gavel came down. Vernon Steele's wife was not in the courtroom. Leroy had noticed her absence when he came in. He did not know what that meant for her, and he did not spend time speculating about it. Afterward, in the corridor, Nadine shook Leroy's hand and told him what came next. The forensic accounting was complete. The VA had calculated the full amount of diverted payments, with interest and adjustments. The figure came to $224,000. After legal costs, which the federal government absorbed as part of the prosecution, the full amount would be dispersed to Beulah Aldrich's account within 90 days. There were 3 other pension cases connected to the investigation, different families, different counties, a wider network than anyone had initially expected. And those were proceeding through their own federal process. Walt Pearson's case was among them. His back payments had already begun arriving. Leroy drove back to Florence in the afternoon sun with the windows down an inch and the radio off. He stopped at a gas station outside Moulton and bought a cup of coffee in a paper cup, and stood by the truck and drank it and watched a red-tailed hawk working the field across the highway, circling low and patient over the brown winter grass. He thought it was probably looking for field mice. He watched it for a while. It found what it was looking for, or moved on. He couldn't tell which. And then it was gone, and he got back in the truck and drove the rest of the way home. Beulah had been back in her house for 3 weeks by then. Leroy had hired Wanda Hobbs, who was 58 and had spent the previous decade caring for 2 elderly parents of her own, and came with a directness that Beulah initially resisted and eventually accepted with the pragmatism she applied to most things she couldn't change. Wanda came mornings on weekdays and stayed through lunch, and on Saturdays she stayed through dinner. She had a gift for working around Beulah's independence rather than against it. She did not help unless asked, and she did not hover, but she was present, and her presence had given the small house a kind of ballast it had been lacking. Leroy visited on Sunday afternoons. He brought groceries and sometimes a pie from a bakery in Florence that Beulah had always approved of, and they ate at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things: the neighbors, the weather, the progress of Wanda's ongoing project of reorganizing the pantry, which Beulah described as unnecessary but tolerated. Occasionally, they talked about the trial. Beulah had not attended. She had not wanted to, and Leroy had not pressed her, but she had read the newspaper accounts with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She had opinions about the federal prosecutor, whom she thought was sharp, and about Hargrove's closing argument, which she described without particular heat as thin. The check arrived in July. Beulah called Leroy on a Tuesday morning and told him he needed to come over. He found her at the kitchen table with an envelope in front of her, already opened. She was wearing her good housecoat, the blue one she kept for church mornings and significant occasions, which told him she had known the check was coming that day and had dressed for it. She had made coffee, and 2 cups were on the table, and she pointed to the one across from her without speaking, and he sat and poured. The check was from the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. The amount was $224,812. Beulah picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the check on the table between them. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Your father," she said finally, "would have said not to make a fuss about it." "He would have," Leroy said. "He would have put it in an account somewhere and gone back to work." She set the cup down. He was like that, practical. She looked at the check again. "I am not going to put it in an account somewhere and not make a fuss." She wanted to give Leroy half. He said no. She pushed, and he said no again, and they went back and forth about it the way they had been going back and forth about things his entire life. Neither of them raising their voices, both of them firm as fence posts. They compromised, finally, on a figure, enough for Leroy to retire fully and without financial concern, and to pursue the photography class he'd mentioned once in passing and thought she hadn't retained. She had retained it. She retained most things, dementia or no, when it came to her son. The rest she kept, and within 3 weeks of the check clearing, she had spoken to a woman at the University of North Alabama in Florence about establishing a scholarship in her husband's name. The university's development office was accustomed to large donors who made a fuss about the process. They were not entirely accustomed to an 85-year-old woman in a blue housecoat who arrived with a bank draft for $50,000, a typed summary of what she wanted the scholarship to do and who it should serve, and a polite but absolute refusal to have a building or a room or a bench named after anyone. The James Aldridge Memorial Scholarship was established in the fall. It supported the children and grandchildren of military veterans from Lauderdale County. Need-based, renewable for 4 years, no requirement beyond the family connection to service and the demonstrated intention to do something with the education. The first 3 recipients were announced in October. One of them was a girl of 19 from a family over near Rogersville, whose grandfather had come back from Vietnam and never quite come all the way back, and who wanted to study nursing. Beulah read about her in the university newsletter that Leroy brought over, and she nodded once and did not say anything about it and changed the subject, which was how Beulah expressed profound satisfaction. The university held a small ceremony to dedicate the scholarship in November. The venue was a conference room, not an auditorium. There was a bronze plaque mounted in the hallway outside, a small thing, tasteful, with James Aldridge's name and dates and rank. Leroy and Beulah stood in front of it for a moment before the ceremony. Beulah reached up and touched the lettering with the tips of 2 fingers, not tracing it, just resting there. Then she put her hand down and straightened her jacket and went into the conference room. Vernon Steele's appeal was filed in January and denied in April. His wife had filed for divorce the previous December. Their children, a son in Decatur, a daughter somewhere in Tennessee, had not attended the sentencing and had not, as far as Leroy could determine, been in contact with their father since the arrest. The family name was not technically changed. Leroy had heard that rumor, and Nadine had told him it was mostly unfounded, but in the county it might as well have been. The name Steele had meant something specific in Lauderdale County for 36 years, and now it meant something entirely different, and that change was permanent in the way that only a particular kind of shame can make permanent. Dwayne Loomis, the sheriff, had not been charged with anything. There was not sufficient evidence that he had known the full extent of what Steele was doing, only that he had been used, likely without full knowledge, as a discouragement. He completed his term and did not run again. Ruth Giles at the records office retired on schedule the following spring with her pension intact. Floyd Tanner's diner continued to open at 6 every morning. These things simply continued, as most things do. Leroy finished the photography class in the spring and enrolled in a second one in the fall. His instructor was a woman from Huntsville who had studied in Atlanta and returned north because, she said, she preferred the light. She told Leroy his eye was good, that he composed things with an instinct for where the weight of an image wanted to land. He accepted the assessment without comment, but thought about it later driving home, the way he'd always thought about things that mattered when he was alone and moving. He shot on film still, not digital. He developed his own prints in a darkroom he set up in the back room of the house, where Norma had kept her sewing. He photographed the county, the river at different hours, the courthouse square in all 4 seasons, the red clay roads going off into tree lines, the last of the old cotton country now mostly gone to pasture. He photographed the rehabilitation facility where his mother had spent 6 weeks, the garden outside it where the patients sat in good weather. He photographed Wanda Hobbs's hands while she was making biscuits without asking her to stop or pose, and she never knew he'd done it until she saw the print. He photographed the old gin property once, on a January morning before the demolition crew arrived. He photographed it in sections, the machinery still standing in the open bays, the peeling paint on the corrugated walls, the yard with the fence mostly down now except for a few posts still standing at the corners. He found post 17 by its position relative to the gate. It was still there, the base of it settled back into the clay, not falling, but no longer fully upright either, leaning at an angle that was both accidental and somehow purposeful, the way things lean when they've been carrying something for a long time and have finally been allowed to put it down. He photographed it in the flat winter light. He photographed the hollow interior where the oilcloth bundle had sat for however long it had sat there. The opening was dark and the light came through it at an angle that made it look like something deliberate, a window in miniature, a small aperture in a piece of rotting wood through which you could see, if you put your eye close enough, a narrow frame of sky. He stood with the camera and the image and the cold morning air and the sound of a crow somewhere in the tree line, and he thought about his father, who had been dead since before Leroy was born, and about what a man leaves behind when he goes and doesn't know what's waiting and can't do anything about it regardless. He thought about the ribbon. He thought about 40 years of small amounts draining away like water through a crack in a foundation, slow enough not to notice, constant enough to matter. He thought about his mother's hand on the bronze plaque in the university hallway, 2 fingers resting against the letters of his father's name. He lowered the camera and let it hang on the strap and stood in the January yard of the old gin property for a while, not taking any more pictures. The crow called again, further away now, and then was quiet. The morning was still and cold and plain, and Leroy was alone in it, and that was all right. He lowered the camera and let it hang on the strap and stood in the January yard of the old gin property for a while, not taking any more pictures. The crow called again, further away now, and then was quiet. The morning was still and cold and plain, and Leroy was alone in it, and that was all right.